Under the flat glare of checkpoint floodlights, Harry Dowell brought his van to a careful stop. The muffler let out a weary sigh as the engine ticked in the cold. The officers stepped out briskly, breath steaming, boots crunching on ice-crusted asphalt. They were young, barely past the age when boys become men, and wore the weight of authority like new coats, stiff, unfamiliar, overly eager. Harry's hands rested calmly on the wheel. The left turn signal still blinked, rhythmic and steady, as if time were politely tapping to remind him he was no longer welcome on the road. His eyes, lined with a quiet fatigue, didn't blink as the first officer approached the driver's side window with a flashlight and a clipboard. "Evening, sir. Please state your destination and purpose." Harry said nothing. He simply nodded toward the glove compartment, where his license and registration sat folded inside a cracked leather case. The officer retrieved the documents and scanned them with practiced efficiency. "This box here," the second officer said, peering into the van's dim interior. "Mind telling us what's inside?" Harry turned slightly. One hand, pale and liver-spotted, rested on the cloth-covered box like a father's hand over a cradle. His gaze met the officer's, not in defiance, but with a kind of immovable calm, like an old oak that has weathered too many storms to flinch at wind. "I'm sorry, sir, but I need you to open the box," the officer insisted, shifting his weight. "You're transporting an unregistered container across the county line. It's standard procedure." Harry didn't move. His hand remained on the box. His silence, though still and unthreatening, carried the weight of refusal. It was the quiet, more than anything else, that triggered suspicion. The officers glanced at each other. Procedure overtook instinct. One made the call to dispatch. The other gently reached into the van, touching Harry's arm with caution. "I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle." Harry complied. No resistance. No anger. Just slow, deliberate movements. His breath came out in short clouds as he stepped onto the icy roadside, coat zipped high, hat pulled low. The box was lifted from the van by gloved hands that didn't recognize reverence when they held it. At the precinct, the warmth inside didn't reach the edges of the room. The linoleum floor was scuffed and cold, the overhead lights harsh. Harry sat on a steel bench, coat folded neatly beside him, eyes on the floor, as if retracing roads long gone. The officers unpacked the box in the evidence room. Beneath layers of cloth was a metallic object that shimmered dully under the light, a disc-shaped insignia the size of a man's palm, weathered but intact. Etched lines crisscrossed its surface in patterns that were neither purely decorative nor easy to decipher. Embedded within its center, sealed behind glass, was what looked like microfilm or data storage, far too old to be modern, and far too advanced to be discarded. No one knew what it was. Fingerprints were submitted. The scanner beeped. The system hesitated. Then the screen blinked once, as if surprised. A line of text appeared, then vanished. The screen turned black. All terminals in the precinct simultaneously shut down. One by one, screens rebooted not to the police operating interface but to a secure federal portal none of the local officers had ever seen. Across all stations, the same words appeared. Suspend all action. Alpha silence protocol activated. Silence thickened in the room, not unlike the heavy hush before a storm. Phone stopped working. Radio communication turned to static. A single red indicator light blinked quietly on the main communications console. No one said anything for a while. Harry sat, motionless, watching shadows move across the floor as officers scurried from desk to desk, whispers turning into arguments, then retreating into murmurs again. Someone tried to restart a system manually. Nothing worked. The override had come from above, so far above that the usual chains of command no longer mattered. The youngest officer, still green from the academy, watched Harry with unease. The man hadn't spoken since he entered the station. Hadn't protested. Hadn't asked for a lawyer. He simply sat, as if waiting for something, or someone. One sergeant stared at the object laid out in the evidence room. He didn't understand it, but the weight in the air told him this was not a normal arrest. Something sacred, perhaps dangerous, had passed through their hands, and no one knew it until now. In the break room, someone muttered, "We shouldn't have touched it." A half-drunk cup of coffee trembled slightly on a desk. Outside, the wind began to rise. Snow flurries spun under the parking lot lights. The old van, still parked outside the station, looked out of place among the patrol cruisers, ancient, dented, holding the kind of history no report would ever capture. Harry, meanwhile, waited. The same patience that had carried him through jungles and deserts now anchored him in a small-town station house, surrounded by men who didn't yet know they were no longer in control. And so, without ceremony, the long-forgotten gears of something greater began to move. Something buried beneath decades of silence, sealed with codes, and carried forward by the hands of an old man in a rusted van. He had not come to disrupt. He had come to deliver. And with his silence, the world around him began to listen. In the heart of the evidence room, fluorescent lights buzzed like insects caught in glass. The metallic insignia sat under a sealed dome, resting on a blue felt tray the clerk had pulled from storage, the kind normally used for handling jewelry or rare coins. But this wasn't either of those. No one could name what it was, and that made it feel heavier. The patterns etched on the surface looked worn by both time and purpose. Not ornamental, but purposeful, lines that curved like rivers across a map, symbols arranged with such precision they felt almost alive. The microfilm embedded in its center pulsed faintly beneath the glass like a heartbeat, though the faint glow may have only been a trick of the room's flickering light. The clerk, a middle-aged man with 30 years of mundane evidence tagging under his belt, leaned in too close. He tagged hang *NS, dr *GS, cash, even the occasional antique sword. But never this. His fingers hovered over the object's edge for a moment, then he stepped back, like a man reconsidering touching the face of something ancient. Across the hallway, in the server room, the IT technician was frantically trying to override the blackout. It wasn't a crash. The system had been intercepted. A digital firewall now sealed off all inputs. The override code, labeled Alpha Silence, was not in any department manual, not in the internal wiki, and not in the emergency protocol binder. By now, every officer on the night shift had gathered near the monitors. Phones buzzed with dead signals. Email portals returned with bounce errors that simply read, "Access restricted." Federal interference. No one knew what to do with Harry Dowell. He still sat quietly, not handcuffed, not restrained. There was no need. He hadn't moved since they brought him in. A stainless steel thermos rested on the bench beside him. No one noticed when he'd brought it in, but it sat there now like a companion, its dented surface matching the wear of the man who owned it. In the back of the station, the duty captain, a man hardened by years of bureaucracy and petty crime, was on his third silent stare at the insignia. He didn't know why he hadn't ordered it returned to the box. He only knew he couldn't, not after the message. There was something about it, like it didn't belong in their world. Like it was waiting for someone else. And someone was, indeed, already coming. They arrived not with sirens but with the steady throb of rotor blades. Snow scattered across the precinct parking lot as the silhouette of a Chinook helicopter descended behind the building. From the sky came a noise older than war and quieter than judgment. It landed with the precision of practiced control, smooth, exact, commanding. Black SUVs followed seconds later, unmarked and matte-finished, tires crunching on gravel as doors opened before the engines had fully stopped. Men and women in gray tactical gear emerged, moving with the stillness of people who didn't need to shout to be heard. No words, no announcements. Just entrance and authority. One figure stepped ahead of the others. General Raymond Brock. Tall, broad-shouldered, silver haircut to regulation. His uniform bore no name, but every star gleamed as if it had been polished in anticipation. Those who knew him knew better than to ask questions. Those who didn't fell quiet under the sheer gravity of his presence. He entered the precinct with a small team in tow, glancing at no one, asking for no directions. He went straight to the evidence room, where the metallic insignia sat beneath its dome. He paused, then lifted the glass cover with his own gloved hands. There was a silence that settled differently now, heavier. Even the buzz of the lights seemed to soften. General Brock didn't speak at first. He held the insignia in both hands and turned it slightly, examining the etched lines as if reacquainting himself with something long lost. "Seal it," he finally said, passing it to a black case held open by a member of his team. "Chain of command begins here." And then he turned to the clerk and added, in a voice both measured and final, "No photographs. No record logs. This was never booked." A dozen officers watched, unable to move or speak. In the adjacent room, Harry Dowell finally stood up. The thermos still sat beside him, but now it seemed smaller, less like a container of coffee and more like a relic. The same insignia, now sealed in black velvet, had been hidden beneath his seat for decades. Until today. The general stepped into the room where Harry stood. There was no salute. No handshake. Just the subtle tightening of his jaw, the recognition in his eyes. "I'll handle this man personally," the general said. And that was the end of local jurisdiction. Harry nodded once. He didn't need to be told what came next. He hadn't planned to be thanked. He hadn't even expected to be understood. All that mattered was that the object had reached the right hands. Outside, the storm had settled into soft flakes. The rotors spun again, snow lifting like ghosts from the ground. The van still sat in the lot. Unmoved, undisturbed. And through every hallway, every office, the memory of that silent moment, when the computers died, when federal protocol crushed local routine, would linger long after the dust settled. Somewhere far from the eyes of that small station, the wheels of history began to turn again. Because an old man had driven 70 miles with a box, a letter, and a vow he hadn't broken in 50 years. The Chinook lifted into the frozen sky, its heavy silhouette vanishing into the low cloud cover like a bird carrying away old truths. The silence it left behind at the Redstone precinct was total, as if the station itself were trying to erase the memory of what had just occurred. No one spoke for several minutes. Not the officers still standing in the doorway. Not the captain, who remained at his desk staring at the line where the insignia had once sat. Even the youngest rookie, who only an hour earlier had joked about Harry being someone's confused grandfather, now sat with his hands folded, eyes wide, throat dry. Something had passed through their lives, something larger than all their authority combined. It had come wrapped in silence, carried by a man who had given no name, offered no resistance, and yet left behind a crater of meaning. The computer systems remained down for the rest of the night. A tech team was en route from Washington, D.C., they were told. No estimated arrival. No request for updates. Only instructions: do not speak to press. Do not share reports. Do not speculate. Internal records of the incident were to be removed by morning. But memories do not delete as easily as files. By noon the next day, whispers had already traveled further than the Chinook's flight path. At a secure hangar on the outskirts of Fort Ridge, Harry Dowell stood before a panel of military officials in uniforms that bore ranks unknown to the public. He had not worn a uniform himself in nearly 5 decades, but now, the olive-drab fabric fit as if the years had merely been folded away and put in storage until needed again. A single spotlight illuminated the table before him. Upon it, the box, his box, had been reopened. The insignia rested in the center, placed carefully beside the sealed envelope he had carried like a final heartbeat. A white-gloved officer handed the envelope to a man seated at the table's center. He sliced the top cleanly and withdrew a single sheet of paper. It was a clearance code, a military key that hadn't been seen in over 50 years. A clearance buried with the ghosts of a mission lost to time. Operation Iron Hush. In the stillness that followed, General Brock stood. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room all the same. This insignia belonged to a special operations unit deployed in Cambodia and Laos during the early 1970s. Codenamed Iron Hush, the unit specialized in extraction under silence, no radio, no trace, no record. Their final mission failed. 13 men were lost. One returned. He turned to Harry. This man. For the first time since his detainment, eyes turned to Harry not with suspicion, but with the gravity reserved for those who had walked through fire and never once asked the world to watch them burn. The general continued. Mr. Dowell carried the insignia out. When the operation was sealed, he kept it hidden. When his son, a Pentagon officer, finalized the declassification, Harry prepared to deliver it, along with his son's final clearance codes. The room shifted subtly, as if the mention of Edward Dowell brought an echo only some could hear. A photo rested on a table in the back, a man in dress uniform, younger than Harry but bearing his quiet eyes. He had died in an aviation incident 3 months earlier. Some suspected sabotage. No proof. Only rumors and the silence of systems that protected more than they served. Now, with the object and codes reunited, the truth could be told. The following morning, a press conference was held on the tarmac of Fort Ridge. Rows of chairs were set before a temporary stage built between two hangars. A cold wind stirred the flags along the fencing. Military officials stood in formation. Reporters whispered among themselves, unaware of the full scope of what was to be revealed. And there, beneath the gray morning sky, walked Harry Dowell. Not as a fugitive. Not as a suspect. But as a soldier, recognized at last. The president stood beside him. A speech was delivered, not from a teleprompter, but from paper, folded and worn. Words handwritten in the margins, as if rewritten several times in the days before. The story of Iron Hush was read aloud. The names of the 13 men who never came home were spoken, one by one, into the wind. A moment of silence followed. When it ended, Harry stepped forward, lifted the insignia from its case, and placed it on a pedestal bearing the Iron Hush motto, "No voice, no trace, no surrender." Behind him, the old van had been towed to the base and parked between military vehicles, its rusted body, cracked windows, and bullet-pierced door left untouched. A ribbon of black and gold now stretched across its hood. This, they said, was the vessel that had carried history safely through silence. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. Veterans and attendants stood at attention as Harry was presented with a commemorative coin, one issued only to those whose service extended beyond protocol, beyond duty. Its center was embossed with the same insignia he had carried for 50 years. The crowd, thick with uniform and civilian alike, fell silent. The commanding officer saluted. And then came the words. For keeping the memory when the world chose to forget. Behind them all, the plaque was unveiled. A simple inscription. To the man who carried silence, and broke it only for truth. The ceremony ended quietly, as Harry had hoped. There was no parade, no anthem. Just the soft shuffling of boots and shoes on cold pavement, the flags lowered in a slow salute, and the hum of distant aircraft preparing for departure. A few officers approached him afterward, offering solemn nods or a brief hand on his shoulder, but he didn't linger. He walked alone toward the van. It looked just as it always had, weather-beaten, dented, indifferent to polish or polishers. Its surface carried the memory of desert heat and mountain frost, of decades spent moving through America's empty spaces. But today, it was more than a vehicle. It was a witness. And Harry, though honored, did not feel victorious. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed once, then settled into a familiar growl. The gearshift trembled as he eased it into drive. One by one, service members and civilians alike parted to clear a path as the van rolled forward, its pace unhurried, dignified. It passed rows of soldiers standing at attention, their faces unreadable but their eyes full. The checkpoint, once a place of suspicion, now stood transformed. The same officers who had once detained him stood at salute, their expressions stiff with respect, their posture perfect. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Sometimes, silence says more than words. Harry did not return to a home adorned with banners or a town bursting with pride. He returned to solitude. To the farm with the creaking windmill, the chipped mailbox, and the acres of grass that had long stopped needing anyone's attention. The barn leaned like an old soldier against time. Inside, tools still hung where he had left them, suspended like echoes. He parked the van beneath the bare-limbed oak where his son had once played, years before uniform and duty had carved them both into quieter men. For days, the world did not intrude. But kindness, once planted, begins to grow, even in soil that has been dry for decades. A letter arrived. Then another. Then a bundle. Folded cards and thick envelopes, some typed, most handwritten. From Gold Star families. From soldiers who had served under his son. From people who had seen the broadcast and wanted to say one thing: you were never forgotten. You just disappeared into the kind of silence most of us are too afraid to enter. Some sent photographs. Others sent thanks. One letter included a drawing by a child, a van, a flag, and a man with a dog tag around his neck and a smile drawn with a shaky red crayon. Then came the visitors. Not reporters. Not officials. But the families of Iron Hush, men and women who had once received letters saying their loved ones would not return, and who never got to ask what really happened. They came with stories and photos, yellowed and creased. A woman in her 70s brought a scrapbook she hadn't opened in years. A man in uniform, now a colonel, showed Harry the field knife his father had carried, recovered, and returned through a contact Harry never knew had completed the circle. One mother, her hair white and her voice brittle, simply placed her hand on Harry's and said, "Thank you for remembering him when no one else could." They gathered in his barn, sitting on bales of hay and upturned buckets, sharing coffee from his old thermos and pie brought in Tupperware. They laughed. They cried. They listened. In the corner, beneath a canvas drape, sat the wooden box. Still latched. Still sacred. The insignia no longer lived there. But something else did, an echo of what had been carried, not just across counties, but across years. They asked Harry if he'd ever considered writing a book. He shook his head. It wasn't a story for paper. It was a story for memory. And memory, he believed, belonged in the hearts of those who needed it, not in the hands of those who wanted to sell it. That winter passed gently. When spring came, the local mayor visited without cameras. A plaque was installed in the town square, beside the Veterans Memorial. Not a statue. Just a stone bench and a brass plate that read, "For Harry Dowell, who kept his promise longer than most would have remembered to make it." Back at the farm, Harry resumed his routines. Twice a week, the van rolled into town. He still paid in exact change. Still parked by the same store. Still nodded quietly to the few who recognized him, not from headlines, but from history. The brass plaque installed on his dashboard gleamed each morning. Harry Dowell, keeper of promises for 50 years. It wasn't a title he asked for. But it was the only one that ever fit. He had outlived the war, the mission, even his own silence. And in the end, he asked for nothing. No statue. No medal. No speech. Only this, that the memory of those who were lost would no longer be buried in classified files or government archives. They had names. They had faces. They had a brother who never forgot. And for the world that watched from a distance, the lesson lingered. Kindness without question is enough.